We turn our attention back to the book of Revelation. Let's just take a second to remember what's going on here in a large scale, so to say. You know, why are we studying this book with all of this information about things that have to happen? These are the things which must happen. Some things, you know, were taking place currently in the church, but then starting in chapter 4, the lion's share of it is things that must happen in the future. Why couldn't God just, snap his fingers and be done with it already? Why all of this detail? Why all of these events yet to come? And I mean, some of that, of course, is within the mind of God, but there are ways in which we can see that, God is making good on his promises. He's making good on his justice. He's showing us in a very real and tangible way that he is God, that he is victorious, and that he will win over our enemy. And we're given a glimpse into that. And today we're going to continue into chapter 17. We began chapter 17 already last time we were together, though I know it's kind of hard to remember back that far because we had a snow day in there and we had Christmas in there, and so we'll do a little bit of backtracking. But it's sort of the second half of 17 that we want to look at a little more in depth. And now chapter 17 is challenging. I mean, at one point I was scribbling on my notepad and Holly happened to walk by and I was like, I'm trying to draw a pictograph here, but I'm struggling. There's a lot of different moving parts. So I did provide a handout that we're going to walk through, and I don't know if everybody got that handout when they came in. Would somebody be willing to maybe, hey, Holly, since you're standing up, could you grab the handouts just in case that are on the thing if somebody didn't get one? I'm going to have it up here, and we're going to we'll walk through it, but for fear that maybe it'll be too small on the screen, I thought it would be good. Now, if you were some of the first comers to arrive here this morning, then you got the color copy. And if you were late to the sanctuary, all that was left maybe was black and white. Are we still doing color, or are we down to black and white? Yeah, black and white. The first 10 or so were color, so. And we can get some more. While those are being handed out, if you need one of those, just a note that the vision of the judgment of the harlot in Babylon gives insight into the events leading up to that judgment and in some senses the reason for the judgment. Just a little bit of a remembrance there. And I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Often I put up the passage verse by verse, and that's what I originally had laid out for this message, and we kind of go through it. But because there's so many moving pieces and because I've put together a visual aid, I thought it would be better and more helpful to kind of read through the passage as we sort of unfold this visual aid to sort of just help us kind of wrap our minds around what's going on with chapter 17. And so just reading the first couple verses of chapter 17, one of the angels who had the 7 bowls, recall that the 7 bowl judgments have been poured out already, came to me and said, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." And there's a number of things that you'll notice, and I don't know if there's any significance to it, but here it's the great harlot or the great prostitute. Later on, it's a woman in the text. If there's some significance to the difference there, I'm not sure. But I think one of the things that we want to be careful to remember is that while, of course, literal prostitution may be in view in terms of the immorality of the earth, right? There's something else going on, which is that the world has prostituted itself to the Baals of the world, so to say. Does that make sense? It's prostituted itself to other pagan religions, which are opposed to the one true teaching and truth of Yahweh. And so I think, that's important to keep in mind. But if you're following with me up on the screen here just for a moment, let's just unpack a little bit of what we've seen to put into context. So we have our prostitute here, and it says that she's the great prostitute in verse 1. But later on in the chapter, and this is why I'm kind of doing this too, because so many of the answers we're looking for come at the end of the whole section, right? So in verse 18 of chapter 17, it tells us that the great prostitute is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Okay? So we have this prostitute in view, but verse 18 tells us that she is symbolic of the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, well, what is that great city? Well, it could have a literal connotation and, in a sense, a symbolic connotation. We were actually just looking at this in Sunday school. Somebody was talking about the significance of the names. And I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'll bring it up since we were talking about it in Sunday school. If you just real quickly flip back to Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. The idea that was brought up in Sunday school is, hey, don't just fly through those genealogies. Think about what's going on there and what the ongoing significance is. Brian, I think you said that, if I remember correctly, or were mentioning something about it. But you have Ham, right? And who's Ham? Well, Ham's the guy that, goes in and sees his father naked and sort of dishonors him in that respect. And Shem and Japheth come in and they walk in backwards and cover him. And when Noah comes out of his stupor, because he was a man of the land and he had grown some wine and he tried it out and got drunk from it, when he comes back to his senses, he curses Ham, right? And he blesses Shem and Japheth. And so Ham's line is sort of this cursed line, as it were. And we see in verse 8, Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Okay? The first centers of his kingdom were what? Babylon. So the very first thing listed as a first center of this great warrior who comes from the line of Ham is Babylon. And it goes on to say, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built what? He goes to a different land, and so the first thing he builds initially is Babylon. He goes to a different sort of area, and the first thing he builds is Nineveh. And we know a little bit about Nineveh, right? It's a wicked place that, obviously caused Israel a lot of grief. Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah. And then it's interesting, it says, that is the great city. Isn't that interesting? That is the great city. So, I'm not saying there's a direct connection there necessarily, but I think when we talk about the great city, what are we talking about? Well, it's had iterations in the past. It was perhaps Babel was a great city in its time, and we know what happened with Babel. The people needed to be scattered. They were trying to make a name for themselves. They were not worshiping God. There was a direct stance against God. They didn't want Yahweh's name. They wanted their own name. And God had to come down and intervene because he knew in his sovereignty if he let that go, the people would have just gone on to hopelessness. They would have been hopeless. So he comes in and shows his grace and intervenes in that situation. Well, we have Babel as an iteration, a literal iteration. Later on, we perhaps have Babylon. Babylon's a huge city in Scripture, right? It's used throughout the Scriptures. And, you've got Nebuchadnezzar there, and you've got really Babylon as the backstory for Daniel, which is very apocalyptic, and there's a lot of connections between Daniel and Revelation. So you have these literal iterations of these cities, which often are centers of pagan religion and are opposed to God. But symbolically, the great city is, in a sense, that city which is opposed to the city of God. You have these two cities. You've got the city of God, which is Jerusalem, and the great city, or the city of Satan, I've just called it, right? And these two cities are at war with one another. And the harlot is symbolic of that. Verse 18 tells us that the harlot, or the great prostitute, is a symbol of the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now, there could be a sense where in the future there is another literal iteration of a city that is, in a sense, ruling over the earth. But the bigger picture, I think, here, and I think it's probably appropriate to see this, is that, Satan has his handle, on the earth. And in a sense, through the city of Satan, comes what comes from it. Evil and wickedness and teachings that are against the Word of God. Now, the text goes on to say that the harlot's sitting on many waters, right? And the many waters, we're told exactly what they are too. In verse 1, it said that she sits on many waters. In verse 15, it specifically tells us that those are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages, which is simply another way of saying she's everywhere, right? She's among all the peoples. She's among all the multitudes. She's in all the nations. She's influencing all the languages. Her impact goes out into the world. And what is that impact? The text tells us it is intoxication, if you see here. And the intoxication has two levels. The first level is the kings. The kings of the world are intoxicated, and from that, we see that the inhabitants of the earth become intoxicated. So she impacts the rulers impact the people, and we see here, it's not going to be everyone in the earth, of course. There is the elect, which we'll see later on in the passage. But on whole, the inhabitants of the earth are swept away in the false teachings and the evil practices of the great city, or the city of Satan, symbolized by the harlot. At some point here, I want to put this up, and I guess I'll do it now, but I don't want you to put too much stock in this sidebar, but I think it's important to see that there's some kind of past-present reality with what's been going on in verses 1 to 3, which is going to be leading into more of a futuristic reality. And the idea is simply that is this intoxication just speaking about something which is yet to come, or is the great harlot already at work? And I think there's a sense in which she's already at work, right? And she'll continue to be at work, but this passage is looking forward to her end, her demise, her judgment, how God ultimately and finally takes care of her, right? And so there's some kind of leading into the future here. So look at verse 3 with me. Revelation chapter 17, verse 3. Then the angel carried me away in the Spirit into a desert, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast covered with blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. So something shifts here in the text, because the angel's first talking to John, right? And he's talking about this great harlot. He's speaking to him, but then he takes John away. In the Greek, in the Spirit's kind of probably like in a way of saying a vision. He takes John up in a vision. And so I put that in here. The angel carried me away in the Spirit into the desert. And I think that's interesting. It just the wilderness or the desert, but it just was notable that the harlot is first pictured as sitting on waters, and then she's pictured as sitting in a desert. And I don't know what the significance there may be, but as I was putting this visual representation here together, I couldn't help but see that distinction. So there she is. She's there, and she's covered with blasphemies, and she's in the desert, as you can see there. And she's on this, she's on this beast. He has 7 heads. I don't know if you can see them all there, but there's 7 heads there, and there's 10 horns. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. And I had mentioned last time I had spoken here that I think that's probably a picture of the fact that she's wealthy. The pagan religions of the world aren't some side thing. They've gained great wealth. They've gained great power. She has everything she needs. And she also has a cup in her hand filled with abominable things, and the filth of her adulteries. And the text goes on to say that it's a mystery, right? And that first word is not probably part of the inscription, but probably best to be understood as she is mysterious in a sense. And the mystery is this: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. And I think it's probably leaning into what I already spoke to you about, which is the idea that there's a mysterious aspect to the fact that the great city, the city of Satan, is impacting the world, right? We see those literal impacts in Babel and then Babylon, and later on, perhaps in other cities that will come into fruition here. But we see it symbolically, the mystery of this great city, the city of Satan, impacting the world. The source of the prostitution with other gods, the source of the abominations of the earth. So this great city is wealthy, but it's also, it says in verse 6, that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, with the blood of those who bore the testimony to Jesus. Even now, we hear in the news stories of Christian lives being taken, or Christians being persecuted and attacked because of their belief in Christ. That's not happening here in Lancaster County, but it is a reality, and it is happening other places in the world. And so, at its worst, at the height of her abominations, she's influenced the pagans, the people who don't believe in God, to even take the lives of believers. The text goes on to say, when I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And it says, why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. So he says, don't be astonished by this. I'm going to explain it to you. Which is always nice when the Scriptures explain something, but it's also hard when the explanation is difficult, which it is a little bit here. It says, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss to go to his destruction. So let's put that up here. This beast once was, still following here, now is not, and will come up out of the abyss, right, later on, to go to his destruction. This is kind of hard to understand, the once was. In other words, he once was in the past, now he's not, and he'll come up to go to his destruction. And the big key that we need to think about here is, what time frame is Jesus referring to for John here? And I think it's likely that it is an allusion back to chapter 13. If you flip back to chapter 13, remember there was 2 beasts, one that came out of the sea, one that came out of the earth. The first one is probably, in a sense, more significant. I saw a beast, in Revelation 13, second part of verse 1, I saw a beast coming out of the sea, and he had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power, and his throne, and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed, and the whole world was astonished and followed the beast. See that? And so it's probably a reference to the fact that the beast once was and now is not, but then he sort of comes out of the abyss, in a sense, back to life. So it's one of these counterfeit miracles, this satanic power that's exercised in the end time with whatever the healing is of the beast in that situation. And just like we saw there, it says in Revelation 17:8 again, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come out of the abyss to go to his destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast. Why? Because he once was, now is not, and yet will come. So I think there's probably a direct connection there between 13 and 17 here. But in any case, those inhabitants of the earth, when they see that beast come out, they're astonished, right? Not everyone's astonished, though. Some people aren't astonished. Who are the ones that aren't astonished by this? Who are the ones that don't believe what they see here, that aren't duped by the counterfeit miracle? Those are the believers, right? And the believers, or the elect, are characterized by this amazing statement here, and you've seen it here. This is a statement which comes up a lot in the Scriptures, and it's always impressive when it does. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world. And just this idea that the book of life is written from the creation of the world, and there are names that are in it, and there are names that are not in it. If that doesn't kind of highlight and show the choice of God before the foundations of the earth, I don't know what does, right? It's almost as if God is saying, the book's written before I made anything. And the names that are in there aren't going to be astonished at this counterfeit miracle. But the names that are not in the book of life, which is the masses, not everyone, not every person in the world, but generally the world in general, are going to be astonished. And there's going to be a great allegiance to the beast and a great following of the beast because of the counterfeit miracles that he accomplishes. Now, verse 9 says that this calls for a mind with wisdom. And as you can see, we're kind of out of space on the first on the first page here. So this whole situation that's up here, this whole situation that we looked at, is sort of going to be unpacked even further. And the unpacking of the situation, specifically the heads and the horns of the beast, that unpacking of more information is something which calls for wisdom. So you can flip your page over, and you can see I've just sort of shrunk all that down. I know you can't see it on the paper there, but it's just kind of symbolic of the fact that all that's still there. It's just we're zooming in now to focus more on what takes a mind of wisdom to understand. And the focus is going to be here again on the beast and the woman. So the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Okay, well, let's try and describe that with pictures here. The 7 heads are the 7 hills on which the woman sits from verse 9. Here we have our seven hills. Make sure I do have 7 there. 5 plus 2 is 7. Yep. And we could, just to make sure I know this is being a little bit whatever, but just to make sure there's no confusion, we could draw an arrow from each of those 7 heads to each of those 7 hills. Now the text goes on to say, they are also 7 kings. Okay, great. So let's show that here. We've got our 7 hills. The 7 heads of the beast represent 7 hills, but those 7 hills are also 7 kings. So we can go ahead and put a crown on each one of those hills to symbolize that. And you may be thinking what I'm thinking as I'm working through this, which is, now why would you do that? You told us that you had 7 heads, which was confusing enough. Then you described those 7 heads and told us that they were 7 mountains. But then you said that those 7 mountains were actually 7 kings. Why not at least just say that the 7 heads were 7 kings, right? Why double up here? And I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't have the corner on the truth for the book of Revelation. But one thought that I did have was that a mountain, what does a mountain represent in a sense? Mountain represents land, right? It represents a place. It represents a location, right? A crown or a king represents a person. And so it could be trying to describe the fact that, the heads of the beast, as it were, are locations and kings, right? Locations that are ruled over by the beast and with people that are ruled over, that are ruling in those locations. So what could be in view here is both locations and kings. You know, there's been a lot of thought into this. Some have thought that perhaps the 7 hills represent Rome, right? Because in ancient antiquity, Rome has been spoken of as the city of 7 hills. But the problem with that is that that's not as cut and dry as we'd like to think, and there was different names for those hills, and then later on it was actually 9 hills instead of 7 hills, and so it's not quite as clear as we may think there. 7's also completion, a number for completion, so it could just be another way of the rule of the beast is over all locations and over all kings, right? So not so much 7 as in an exact 7, but 7 as in a total and a complete covering. I also had a random thought that there were 7 continents, if I got my understanding correct there. And, is it another way of saying that there are, that just showing rulership over all the areas of the earth? But in any case, that's what the text says. I've been trying to be as direct to the text as I can here with walking through this. In fact, I've discovered, tangent here, I've discovered a little side job that I could do to make myself some extra money, and that is to get somebody to create pictures that are biblically accurate for sermons. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to find a biblically accurate beast online, right? It's like they don't have the right amount of heads, they don't have the right amount of horns, they don't have the colors. Why can't somebody just, make a beast with a woman wearing scarlet and purple? That's impossible. They're in red, they're in purple. No one did what the text actually said. Put them in purple and red, right? So that's what we need. We need some pictures we need somebody to make pictures that are biblically accurate. That's beside the point. Moving on here. This calls for wisdom. The 7 heads or 7 hills on which the woman sits, they are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. So let's mark that here on our chart. 5 of them have fallen. We'll put an X through them. 1 is, right? 1 is. We have 1 who is there. And the other has not yet come. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. Now it also says that the beast, who once was and now is not, is an 8th king, and he belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. All right, I didn't lose you yet, did I? This is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So you can look up here if you would with me. We have, if you look at those boxes, those breakout boxes on the right of your page, you have 5 that have fallen, 1 that is, the others that hasn't come. When he does come, he must remain for a little while. We have the beast here who once was and now is not, but that beast is going to come back and he's going to serve as an 8th king, if you can see there. So now that 8th king, this text specifically tells us that he belongs to the 7. So there's some sense in which he's right in with that group. He's right in with that total world rulership and dominance of the world. He's a part of that. And he's an 8th king. I know one of the big questions is, what do these mountains and kings actually represent? If at the time of John's writing, 5 have fallen, what does that refer to? Here again, if we say that it's Rome or Roman emperors, that doesn't quite make sense, because the one who would be during John's time, Domitius or Dominatus, what is his name? Forget. But anyway, the Roman emperor would have persecuted right around the time of John. He's out of the picture by at least 100 AD, and then you've got many other Roman emperors that come after him up until the 400s AD. So if you're pinpointing a mountain per emperor, you don't have enough mountains. Does that make sense? So it seems hard to say that it's specifically referring to Roman emperors. And I don't know. That's the hard thing. I'm not sure, what these mountains and these kings refer to. The one who has not come yet, that's hard to say. Who can really say what that is? From the time that John got this apocalypse, has that one come yet? Is he here now? whatever it is, he's the one that's remaining for a little while. This text specifically tells us that, so at least gives the picture of him being in place. But if you pressed me and you said, David, I want you to give us your best guess. What's your best guess here? What do you think this could refer to? One thought that I did have about it is, do these mountains kind of refer to, in a sense, the great cities and rulerships over mankind in history past? And when I say I'm thinking broadly, I mean I'm thinking really broadly. So, for example, you have the great cities and the rule of man prior to the flood, right? Prior to the flood. So man had a government, he had a civilization, he had a people that turned away from God prior to the flood. That one's done, right? It was wiped away in the flood. Then you have rulerships which grew up and, became Babel, right? And became Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the people that fell out of them. That's another rulership which is kind of done and in the past. After that, you would have had the time of the Egyptians, right? And the Egyptians, in a sense, ruled the world and provided in a sense, they were the kind of the source of paganism and of the pantheon that had such an impact on the earth. But the Egyptian dynasty came to an end. Then you had the time of the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, and we know that those times came to an end as well. Now, I don't know if I have the exact number I need there, but all I'm simply saying is that there are large spanning periods in the past where men have ruled and turned away from God, and those things have come and they've gone. What was the current one? Was that current one the Roman Greek Empire at the time of John's writing? If that has come to an end, what is the one that we are now in? We know for a fact that in the future end times, that eighth one likely refers to the beast, right? Of course, and his rulership, and his rule over the earth. So I'm inclined to think that these mountains and kings refer not so much to one person, but to general time periods potentially. But I don't know that. I don't know that. I'm not sure, and that's all I can say about it. Where were we? Verse 12. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. So if you look at these 10 horns and we draw some arrows down from each of those 10 horns, we see we have 10 kings. They haven't yet received a kingdom, so these are definitely likely futuristic. But for 1 hour, they will receive authority of kings along with the beast. 10 kings who haven't yet received a kingdom, but for 1 hour, along with the beast, these 10 kings are going to receive authority. Now, if we're talking about the tribulation period, 1 hour is not that long, right? These 10 kings essentially come into power, and they are not in power very long. They just have a brief stint of power, and they basically have one purpose, and it tells us what that is here. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. So their one purpose here, essentially, of these 10 kings is to elevate the beast. And we see what happens next. They will make war against the Lamb. So, yes, something else sort of happens before that, before the war with the Lamb. It doesn't say it next in the text, but what actually happens is the 10 kings give authority to the beast. They have that one purpose. And then it seems like the beast hates the harlot, and the 10 kings hate the harlot. And so the beast and the 10 kings actually dispose of the harlot. And so she's out of the picture. And then after that, we see that there is that war with the Lamb. And of course, we know what happens there because he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The Lamb is victorious over the beast. And let's just read that here just so that we can say just to read the text rather than have me explain it. But they will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them. Why will the Lamb overcome, guys? Because he's God. He's Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Of course he has power over the beast. Of course he's going to win that war. Of course he'll be victorious. and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, and this is explaining some of the things that I've already showed you, as we went through. The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are the peoples, multitudes, nations, and language. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked, and will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Now this is kind of weird. Why is it that Satan would go against Satan, so to say? Jesus kind of alludes to this. If Satan's against Satan, his house will fall. Well, that's kind of what happens. In God's sovereignty, he puts it into the heart of the beast and the 10 kings to go against their own, so to say, and to wipe out the great city with the pagan religion. Then they go to war against the Lamb, and the Lamb wipes them out. So it's simply a succession of events. It says, verse 17, "For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled." So God is essentially accomplishing his ends and even using, these wicked entities to accomplish his purposes. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So in any case, I hope that maybe looking through this graphic has helped you sort of begin to try to wrap your mind around what's going on here. But just as we the Lamb will overcome them, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. But as we sort of wrap up and move to a time of communion, I want to just encourage us not to lose sight of the big ideas. There's a lot of details going on, and the details are important. That's why they're in God's Word, and we've gone to an effort to try to consider them. But the big idea here is clear, right? God is victorious. Yes? God is victorious. His chosen ones in the book of life before the foundations of the world will not ultimately be deceived by what's going on. God will accomplish his ends. He'll see his children through this, and he will ultimately be the one who has victory over the enemies of the earth and over the pagan religions of the earth in the end times. And he is victorious now in the sense that in what Christ has done for us, we have victory in Jesus, but in a literal sense and in a physical sense, as we see the culmination of these things at the end of time, Christ will come and establish his rulership on the earth, and he will literally be here, and he will literally rule over the earth, and he'll be victorious in that way as well. And so as we celebrate communion today, it's kind of, I think, it's always a good day to celebrate communion, but it's kind of neat today because I think what we're doing, particularly this morning, is remembering God's victory on our behalf, right? His victory and his conquering of sin on our behalf. Just as God will come in and will rule that day and will cause and move the events of time in his favor to accomplish his